My name is Willow. I'm in my late 30s. And for most of my adult life, I've worked in rooms where decisions are made quietly and consequences arrive much later. I'm not the loudest person at the table. I don't fight for attention. I don't dominate conversations. People tend to describe me as steady, reliable, and easy to work with. And sometimes, when they think I can't hear, it's harmless. That perception followed me for years. I learned early that when you don't announce yourself, others will happily decide who you are for you. They'll fill in the blanks with whatever makes them most comfortable. Usually, that meant underestimating me. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about humiliation or dramatic takedowns. There are no villains twirling mustaches, no explosive confrontations. What happened unfolded slowly, almost politely. It's about realization, about the moment I walked into a meeting and realized it was a setup. Not because someone said something obvious, but because the air in the room felt decided before I sat down. What makes this harder to explain is that no one broke the rules. No one raised their voice. No one technically lied, and yet everyone already knew the outcome. I was the last to find out. If you've ever been the person who shows up prepared, loyal, consistent, only to realize you were never meant to be part of the decision, this story may feel uncomfortably familiar. I want to be clear about something from the start. I'm telling this honestly, without dramatizing pain or polishing myself into a hero. I stayed quiet longer than I should have. I ignored signals because it was easier than disrupting stability. I mistook being trusted with being valued. This narrative is about how subtle disrespect becomes normalized, how silence can be misread, and how power doesn't always announce itself when it shifts. It's about psychological reversal, not through aggression, but through clarity, through choosing restraint when reaction would have been easier, through understanding leverage only after realizing how invisible you've been allowed to become. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through who I was to them, the small cuts I dismissed, the role I was assigned without consent, and the quiet decisions that changed everything. There's no fantasy here, just a slow, deliberate reclaiming of agency. If you're listening for chaos, you won't find it. But if you're listening for truth, the kind that unfolds in hindsight and lingers long after the room empties, then stay with me. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever realized, too late, that the room had already decided who you were allowed to be? Before anything went wrong, before I noticed the pattern, before the meeting that would later rearrange my understanding of everything, I need you to understand who I was to them. I wasn't disliked. That's important. Dislike leaves friction. Friction leaves evidence. What I experienced was smoother than that. I was accepted, welcomed even. I was the kind of person people were relieved to see on a calendar invite, the one who made things easier by being predictable, calm, competent. If a project was behind, they'd loop me in. If a process was broken, I'd quietly fix it. If someone needed cover, context, documentation, continuity, I was already there. I became associated with stability. And stability, I learned, is often mistaken for compliance. In meetings, my name was usually paired with phrases like "Willow will handle it" or "Let's defer to Willow on logistics." I was trusted with execution, not direction, with details, not outcomes. When people disagreed, they debated around me, not with me. My role was to absorb decisions, not shape them. At first, I told myself that it was just my temperament. I wasn't hungry for the spotlight. I didn't need to dominate conversations to feel secure. I liked listening more than speaking. I believed, sincerely, that good work would eventually speak for itself. That belief lasted longer than it should have. The thing about being quiet is that people project onto you. They assume your silence is agreement, or indifference, or a lack of ambition. No one ever asked which one it was. They just chose the version that served them best. I remember one colleague once saying, half joking, "Willow's unshakable, she'll adapt." Everyone laughed. I smiled because it sounded like a compliment. Only later did I understand what it really meant. You don't need to be consulted. You'll absorb whatever we decide. I wasn't invisible in the obvious way. My calendar was full. My inbox never rested. My work was referenced constantly. But my perspective, my judgment, my boundaries existed only in theory. There's a specific kind of invisibility that comes from being too reliable. When you never cause disruption, people stop checking whether you should be carrying what you carry. They just keep adding weight. And I carried it without complaint, not because I was afraid, not because I lacked confidence, but because I believed in proportion. I believed in timing. I believed that restraint was maturity. What I didn't realize was that restraint, when unacknowledged, becomes permission. Over time, small things began to define me in ways I hadn't chosen. I was the safe option, the neutral presence, the person who wouldn't push back publicly. When leadership shifted, when priorities changed, when new voices entered the room, I remained constant, useful, dependable, replaceable, though no one said it out loud. If someone asked for feedback, it was usually after the decision had already been made. My input became a formality, not a factor. I was invited to meetings where my role was to listen, document, and later explain the outcome to others. I told myself that influence didn't need visibility, that quiet impact was still an impact. But here's the truth I avoided. If your absence wouldn't change the decision, your presence was never essential. That realization didn't come all at once. It arrived in fragments, in patterns I didn't want to see yet. At this stage, I still believed I was respected. I still believed the system was rational, that if I stayed steady, things would eventually rebalance. I didn't feel wronged. I felt misplaced, like furniture everyone leaned on, but no one noticed until it was gone. And so to them, I was easy. Easy to assign, easy to overlook, easy to underestimate. Not because I lacked depth, but because I never demanded to be seen. At least not yet. The first moment didn't announce itself as important. It almost never does. It happened during a routine update meeting, one of those recurring gatherings where the agenda looked identical every week, but the undercurrents quietly shifted. I had prepared a short briefing, nothing dramatic, just a clean summary of risks that were beginning to surface, the kind that don't explode immediately but corrode outcomes over time if left unattended. When my turn came, I spoke the way I always did. Measured, factual, restrained. I wasn't trying to alarm anyone. I wasn't trying to control the room. I simply laid out what I was seeing and suggested a small adjustment in direction. There was a pause, not an uncomfortable one, not hostile, just empty. Then someone senior smiled and said, "That's helpful context, Willow. Let's circle back to execution timelines." And just like that, the conversation moved on. No one challenged my point. No one disagreed. It was treated as if it had been noted, the corporate equivalent of being gently placed on a shelf. In the room, nothing changed. People nodded, typed, and sipped their coffee. If you'd been watching, you wouldn't have seen anything worth remembering. And that's why everyone else forgot it. But I didn't, because something subtle had shifted, not in what they said, but in what they didn't ask. No follow-up, no curiosity. No, "Can you expand on that?" It was the first time I realized my observations were being received as optional. After the meeting, one colleague caught up with me in the hallway and said, "Good catch in there." Casual, friendly, as if what I'd raised was already behind us. I thanked them, smiled, and went back to my desk. But the feeling lingered. Not anger, not embarrassment, something quieter. A sense that a line had been crossed without permission and without witnesses. Like a door that had been closed softly enough that no one heard the latch. I told myself not to overthink it. This was a busy environment. Not every point gets airtime. I'd been in enough rooms to know that timing mattered. I rationalized it the way reasonable people do. It wasn't personal. It wasn't deliberate. It wasn't worth noting. Except it was. Because from that day on, I noticed a pattern. When I raised concerns early, they were acknowledged but deferred. When others raised the same concerns later, louder, closer to consequence, they were treated as insight. The content didn't change. Only the source did. Still, I said nothing. I adjusted my language, softened my phrasing even more. I learned to preface observations with disclaimers. This might be minor, or just something to keep an eye on. I thought humility would protect the message. It didn't. What it did was teach the room that my words came with no urgency attached. That first small cut wasn't painful. It didn't bleed. But it changed the way I listened after that. I began paying attention not just to decisions, but to how they were formed. Who was invited into the uncertainty, and who was only looped in once the outcome was already leaning in a certain direction. I noticed how quickly my role snapped back into place. Recorder, stabilizer, translator of decisions I hadn't influenced. And I noticed something else too, something more unsettling. No one thought they were dismissing me. There was no malice in it, no intention to sideline or diminish, which meant there was also no awareness. My input wasn't being rejected, it was being absorbed and neutralized, smoothed into the background noise of competence. That's a dangerous place to live professionally. Because when disrespect is subtle enough, you start policing yourself on its behalf. You stop questioning whether something was fair and start asking whether you're just being sensitive. I remember closing my notebook that afternoon and feeling a quiet resolve form. Not to confront, not to escalate, but to remember. If this were a one-off, it would fade. If it wasn't, I wanted to see it clearly. And that decision, to watch instead of react, would later matter more than I understood at the time. Once something happens twice, it stops feeling accidental. I didn't mark the second moment in my calendar. I didn't write about it in my notebook. I didn't even acknowledge it consciously at first. That's how normalization works. It arrives disguised as routine. By then, I had already adjusted my expectations. I spoke less in meetings, but more precisely. I waited for openings instead of creating them. I learned which topics were considered mine and which ones were better left untouched, even if I had more context than anyone else in the room. No one asked me to do this. I did it instinctively. Self-correction, masquerading as professionalism. When decisions were announced, I listened carefully to the language. We've decided. Leadership feels. The direction is. Those phrases appeared more often now, usually before discussion had actually occurred. And when I did offer perspective, it was placed after the fact, like commentary, not contribution. The strange thing was how reasonable it all sounded. There was always an explanation. Time pressure, alignment, scope. I absorbed these justifications easily because they were familiar. I'd used them myself once. They're the vocabulary of people who believe the system is fair, even when it isn't balanced. The dismissals never came sharply. They arrived wrapped in politeness. That makes sense. We'll take that under advisement. Good point. Then the conversation would drift, and somehow the outcome would land far from where my input had pointed. I started to notice how often my ideas resurfaced later, detached from my name. Someone would say weeks later, "We should consider documenting this more carefully." Or, "We may want to flag this risk earlier next time." And heads would nod as if a new insight had entered the room. I never said I mentioned that. I never corrected the record. Part of me believed it didn't matter. The idea was what counted, not the credit. That's what mature professionals think, right? Another part of me, quieter, harder to face, knew that credit is how presence is measured. The absence of credit slowly rewrites your value. Still, I stayed. I told myself I was choosing stability over ego, that I was playing the long game, that influence takes time. I reminded myself that I didn't want to be the kind of person who demanded recognition for every contribution. What I didn't admit was that I was tired. Tired of calibrating my tone, tired of packaging clarity and softness, tired of watching rooms fill with confidence that wasn't backed by understanding. But fatigue doesn't always produce anger. Sometimes it produces accommodation. I began anticipating dismissal and adjusting in advance. I'd think, this won't land, and edit myself down to something smaller. I'd think they're already leaning another way, and save my energy for implementation instead of challenge. And here's the most dangerous part. It worked. The less I disrupted, the smoother things felt. The more agreeable I became, the more I was trusted with responsibility. My workload increased. My access remained. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. Inside, something was shrinking. I wasn't being silenced, I was being trained to believe that my role was to maintain momentum, not redirect it. That my insight was supportive, not directive. That my value lay in execution, not judgment. And because I wasn't openly opposed, no one ever checked whether I was still aligned. There were moments, small, almost embarrassing ones, where I considered pushing back, asking why certain voices were amplified and others gently bypassed. But the cost felt disproportionate. I didn't want to be seen as difficult, or emotional, or misreading the room. So I did what many competent people do. I internalized the imbalance and externalized the responsibility. If I were clearer, if I spoke earlier, if I framed it better. I treated systemic dismissal like a personal communication problem. That's how disrespect becomes normal. Not because it escalates, but because it settles. It becomes the background hum you stop noticing until the silence would feel strange without it. By this point, I was no longer surprised when my input was sidelined. I was surprised when it wasn't. And that should have been the signal. But instead of acting, I adapted, quietly, professionally. I stayed useful, I stayed calm, I stayed in my lane. What I didn't realize yet was that every time I chose ease over clarity, I was teaching the room something about me, something that would later be very hard to unteach. Roles don't always arrive with titles. Sometimes they form quietly, through repetition, through what people come to rely on you for, and what they stop expecting from you altogether. By the time I recognized the shape of mine, it had already solidified. I was the one who would handle it, not define it. Don't question it, handle it. If there was ambiguity, it came to me after the decision. If there was fallout, I was looped in to smooth it. If there were questions from outside the room, I was trusted to explain the reasoning with clarity and calm, even when I hadn't agreed with it. I became the interpreter of choices I hadn't helped make. There's a particular irony in that. Being so trusted with the narrative, yet excluded from authorship. I noticed how conversation shifted when I entered a room. Not abruptly, just subtly. People relaxed. The tension softened, because my presence signaled continuity. I wasn't there to challenge direction. I was there to ensure nothing broke. That, I realized, was the role, structural support. And structures are only noticed when they fail. When new initiatives were discussed, I was consulted on feasibility, not philosophy. On resources, not rationale. When risks were debated, I was asked how to mitigate them, not whether they were worth taking. It wasn't that I lacked opinions. It was that the system had learned it didn't need to hear them. Once, during a planning session, someone said, without irony, "Willow will keep us grounded." Everyone nodded. I did too. It sounded respectful, responsible, but what it really meant was, "You'll keep things stable while we decide." That moment stayed with me longer than it should have, because grounding is not leadership, it's containment. The role came with unspoken expectations. I would remain neutral. I would remain composed. I would absorb uncertainty so others could move quickly. I would not escalate discomfort into debate, and to my own surprise, I fulfilled those expectations well. I didn't push back because the cost felt abstract, because the role rewarded me with proximity, with trust, with being needed, and need can masquerade as importance if you're not careful. But there were signs, small telling ones. I stopped being asked what I thought would happen. I was asked how to implement what they thought would happen. I was informed of decisions before they were announced publicly, but after they were finalized. My inclusion became logistical, not strategic. I had access without agency, and still I stayed quiet, partly because I didn't know how to step out of the role without seeming ungrateful, partly because I wasn't ready to admit how much I'd allowed it to define me, and partly because I believed, naively, that reliability would eventually earn reciprocity. That belief kept me cooperative longer than it should have. The truth is, once a role becomes convenient to others, it's very difficult to renegotiate. Any deviation feels like a disruption, a breach of character. When someone who is always steady questions direction, it unsettles the room more than if a known contrarian does it. I could feel that unspoken tension whenever I hesitated, when I paused longer than usual before agreeing, when my silence lingered just a beat too long. People noticed, they just didn't ask why. Instead, the system adjusted around me. Conversations happened earlier, without me. Alignment was reached before meetings began. By the time I was present, the shape of things was already set. That's when I understood something essential. I wasn't being excluded. I was being positioned. Positioned as support, not source. As anchor, not compass. And I had participated in that positioning by staying agreeable, adaptable, and quiet for too long. The role wasn't assigned in a single moment. It was built collaboratively, by their expectations and my compliance. And once I saw it clearly, I couldn't unsee it. The unsettling part wasn't realizing how they saw me. It was realizing how accurately they had learned what I would tolerate. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no sharp email, no moment anyone else in the room would later point to and say, "That's when things changed." In fact, nothing outward changed at all. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, in a meeting I almost didn't attend. The agenda was routine, a check-in on progress, a review of next steps. I arrived on time, took my usual seat, and opened my notebook. The conversation unfolded predictably. Updates delivered, decisions referenced as if they'd emerged organically, even though I knew where and when they'd actually been made. Halfway through, a slide appeared on the screen. I recognized it instantly. Not just the content, the structure, the language, the sequencing. It was a reframed version of a risk assessment I had written months earlier, cleaned up, streamlined, detached from its origin. As the presenter spoke, they described it as a recent insight, something that had become clear over time. Heads nodded, notes were taken. The tone was impressed. I sat very still, not because I was angry. That surprised me. I expected a spike of emotion, irritation, maybe even resentment. But what I felt instead was clarity, because in that moment, I understood something without needing to name it. I was no longer part of the conversation in the way I thought I was. My work had value, my presence did not, and that distinction settled quietly, almost gently in my chest. I looked around the table and realized I wasn't being ignored. I was being managed. My input had been harvested, repackaged, and redistributed in a way that removed any need for my continued participation at that level. This wasn't theft, it wasn't malicious, it was efficient. And it worked because I had made it easy. As the meeting continued, I noticed how relaxed I felt. That was the most unexpected part. No tension in my shoulders. No urge to interrupt or correct. Just a steady awareness that something had concluded internally. Not ended, concluded. I stopped taking notes halfway through, not out of defiance, but because I didn't need them anymore. I already understood the pattern. When the meeting ended, people gathered their things, chatting casually. Someone thanked me, as they often did, for keeping things organized. I nodded, smiled, and walked back to my desk. But I didn't sit down right away. I stood by the window instead, looking out at the city. The light was fading. Offices across the street were lit unevenly, some bright, some dark, some already empty. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel responsible for what was happening next. That's when the shift completed itself. I didn't decide to confront anyone. I didn't plan an exit. I didn't even articulate a strategy. What changed was simpler and more irreversible. I stopped assuming good faith would eventually correct the imbalance. I stopped believing that patience alone created equity. And I stopped measuring my value by how indispensable I was to people who didn't see me as essential. This wasn't bitterness, it was recalibration. I realized that silence didn't have to mean endurance. It could mean observation. That restraint didn't have to be passive. It could be deliberate. Most importantly, I understood that the role I'd been assigned only functioned if I continued to perform it without question. And I didn't owe that performance anymore. Nothing about my behavior changed that day. I completed my work. I responded to messages. I showed up where expected. From the outside, I remained exactly the same. But internally, a line had been drawn. I was no longer waiting to be seen. I was watching. And that shift, from hoping the room would notice me to quietly noticing the room, altered everything that followed. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reactive, something I defaulted to because it felt safer, more professional, less disruptive. Now it has become intentional, chosen, observed. I still spoke when asked, I still contributed when necessary. But I stopped filling gaps that weren't mine to fill. I stopped volunteering context that others hadn't earned. I stopped translating ambiguity into clarity for people who benefited from staying vague. From the outside, nothing looked different. That was the point. People tend to notice when you withdraw loudly. They almost never notice when you simply stop compensating. I watched meetings unfold without intervening. When assumptions were made that I knew were flawed, I let them stand unless the risk was irreversible or unethical. When timelines were optimistic, I didn't soften them preemptively. I allowed reality to meet expectation without my buffer in between. And something fascinating happened. The room didn't become more cautious. It became more confident. My silence was interpreted not as discernment, but as agreement. That told me everything I needed to know. Where once I had been the stabilizer, now I was the absence of resistance. My quiet was taken as confirmation that things were fine, that no deeper consideration was required. It wasn't malicious, it was habitual. I realized how often I had been the unacknowledged counterweight, slowing momentum just enough to prevent mistakes, raising questions early enough to adjust course. Without that friction, decisions moved faster. They just didn't move better. I kept my notebook closer now, not for meeting notes, for patterns. Who spoke first? Who summarized? Whose ideas were treated as direction versus suggestion? Which concerns were framed as strategic, and which were reframed as operational noise? I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct. I let people show me exactly how the system worked when I wasn't quietly propping it up. Some colleagues grew more relaxed around me. They mistook my reduced engagement for acceptance. A few even became more candid, speaking freely in my presence as if I were part of the furniture, there, but not actively listening. That was a mistake on their part, because I was listening more closely than ever. I noticed how often responsibility flowed downward, while authority flowed sideways, how accountability was diffuse when things went well, and suddenly very specific when they didn't. I noticed how narratives were shaped before meetings even began, and how my previous role had been to legitimize those narratives after the fact. And I noticed how no one checked in. No one asked why I had less to say. No one asked whether I agreed. The system didn't register my silence as a signal because it had never been trained to see me as a variable. That's when it became clear. My voice had only been valued when it was convenient, so I stopped offering it freely. This wasn't passive aggression, it wasn't withdrawal, it was conservation. I conserved my insight, my energy, my alignment. I answered exactly what was asked, no more, no less. When someone sought reassurance, I gave facts, not comfort. When ambiguity surfaced, I let it remain visible instead of smoothing it over. Others began to mistake this for detachment, for fatigue, for disengagement. That misinterpretation worked in my favor, because when people assume you're less invested, they stop managing your perception. They reveal more. They take fewer precautions. They speak as if you no longer factor into outcomes. And that's a powerful position to occupy, being underestimated without being excluded. I wasn't retreating, I was repositioning. Silence, I learned, isn't absence. It's space. And space, when held deliberately, allows truth to surface without interference. I didn't know yet what I would do with what I was learning. I didn't have a plan. But I was no longer confused. And clarity, once it arrives, has a way of making future decisions inevitable. What they never noticed was how much information flowed through me. Not because I demanded it, but because the system had been built that way. Processes, approvals, handovers, follow-ups. I was copied by default. Looping me in was a habit, not a strategy. They assumed my quiet meant passivity. It didn't occur to them that it meant attention. I began to document things differently. Not obsessively, not defensively, just clearly. I noted timelines as they actually happened, not as they were later described. I kept versions of documents that showed how language evolved, how certainty appeared only after outcomes were already leaning in one direction. I didn't collect this out of spite. I wasn't building a case against anyone. I was building context. Context is power when narratives start to drift. I noticed how often decisions were described as consensus when dissent had simply been absent or unheard. How accountability was framed as collective until it became inconvenient. How memory softened around moments of uncertainty once results were visible. And I noticed how rarely anyone expected me to remember. That assumption, that I was focused on tasks, not patterns, created blind spots. People spoke freely around me. They forwarded emails without filtering. They asked me to summarize conversations they didn't want to attend. I became a quiet archive, not in a dramatic way. I didn't hoard secrets. I didn't trap anyone in their words. I simply retained what others discarded once it no longer served them. I also started learning, not new technical skills. I had those. I learned structures, how authority was actually exercised versus how it was described. Which decisions required formal approval, and which were rubber-stamped after informal alignment. Where risk truly lived, and where it was merely discussed. I paid attention to legal language, to financial thresholds, to what triggered review and what bypassed it entirely. These weren't hidden systems. They were just invisible to people who assumed they didn't need to know. I needed to know. Quietly, I repositioned myself. I accepted projects that gave me broader visibility rather than higher status. I volunteered for transitional work, the unglamorous kind that touches multiple departments. I became harder to categorize. From the outside, it looked like more of the same. Willow is being helpful, Willow stepping in, Willow is keeping things moving. But internally, my posture had changed. I stopped anchoring myself to any single outcome. I observed how outcomes were manufactured, and something else became clear. I wasn't the only one being underestimated. There were others, talented, thoughtful people, whose voices softened around louder ones. People who had learned to survive by contributing just enough to stay relevant. I watched how they navigated, how they disappeared in plain sight. I didn't recruit them. I didn't align with them overtly. I just understood that the system rewarded noise, not accuracy, and punished clarity when it disrupted momentum. That understanding sharpened my focus. I stopped correcting misattributions unless they crossed ethical lines. I let small inaccuracies stand, not because they didn't matter, but because correcting them prematurely would have exposed my awareness. Instead, I let patterns accumulate. I noticed how certain individuals position themselves as decision makers without carrying consequence, how others absorbed fallout while credit floated upward. I noticed how quickly narratives hardened once shared externally, and how much effort went into maintaining them internally. And still no one noticed me noticing. Because I didn't change my demeanor. I didn't grow colder or sharper. I remained calm, polite, reliable. I asked clarifying questions that sounded logistical but revealed structural gaps. Just to confirm, was this approved before or after the adjustment? Which version are we referencing for the final sign-off? Neutral questions, precise answers. Over time, I realized something important. I was closer to the truth than the people shaping the story. Not because I was smarter, but because I was patient. This wasn't about waiting for a moment to strike. There was no strike coming. This was about understanding the terrain so thoroughly that any future move, if it came, would be grounded in reality, not reaction. They never noticed the shift because it didn't disrupt them. Preparation rarely does. It looks like continuity. It sounds like cooperation. It feels like safety. Until it doesn't. The reveal didn't come with adrenaline. There was no rush, no satisfaction, no sense of victory. When it happened, it felt almost disappointing in its simplicity, like discovering that a lock you'd been studying for months wasn't complex at all, just unattended. I was reviewing a routine set of documents late one evening. The office was quiet in that way. It only is after everyone who needs to be seen has already left. I hadn't stayed late to work harder. I stayed because quiet spaces make patterns easier to see. That's when it surfaced. Not a secret, not misconduct, just an alignment issue so fundamental that no one had thought to question it. A structural dependency that had gone unacknowledged because it benefited too many people to examine closely. I remember leaning back in my chair and letting the realization settle. Not with excitement, but with a strange calm. This was the leverage, not power over people, power over process. The system depended on continuity that only existed because I, and a few others like me, maintained it. Decision trails, compliance logic, operational memory. The things no one wanted to own outright, but everyone assumed would be there when needed. I hadn't created this dependency. I had inherited it. And more importantly, I had never formalized it. That meant two things. First, the organization was more fragile than it appeared. Second, I was carrying far more responsibility than my role acknowledged. Seeing that clearly changed how I felt. Not about them, but about myself. I wasn't angry. I wasn't triumphant. I was sober. Because leverage isn't exciting when you understand its implications. It carries weight, ethical weight, the kind that forces you to decide not just what you can do, but what you should. I closed the documents and didn't touch them again that night. Instead, I walked home slowly, letting the city breathe around me. Traffic hummed, lights reflected off wet pavement. People moved with purpose, unaware of the quiet recalibrations happening inside someone else's mind. I didn't plan anything on that walk. I didn't imagine outcomes. I didn't rehearse conversations. I simply acknowledged the truth I had uncovered. The balance of influence was not where it appeared to be. And I had been compensating for that imbalance for years without realizing it. The next few days passed normally. Meetings, emails, check-ins. No one sensed a shift because none had occurred yet. The difference was internal. I stopped asking myself whether I was being treated fairly. I started asking whether I was participating honestly. Because once you see leverage, continuing as before becomes a choice, not a default. I reviewed my responsibilities with fresh eyes. Which ones were explicit? Which ones existed only because I had absorbed them over time? Which ones exposed me to risk without authority? The answers were uncomfortable. I realized that my silence hadn't just protected others, it had protected the system from examining itself. By smoothing transitions, by filling gaps, by absorbing ambiguity, I had allowed inefficiencies to masquerade as stability, and I was tired of carrying that alone. Still, I didn't rush. I didn't reveal what I knew. I didn't hint. I didn't posture. Leverage loses its integrity when used theatrically. It becomes manipulation instead of alignment. What I needed was clarity, not dominance. I took time to consider what outcome would allow me to remain aligned with my values. I wasn't interested in exposure or embarrassment. I didn't want apologies that would evaporate under pressure. I wanted structural truth, a recalibration that didn't depend on anyone admitting fault. That narrowed the path considerably. There was only one way forward that wouldn't require confrontation or coercion. One option that respected my ethics and acknowledged reality. It would be quiet, it would be slow, and once initiated, it couldn't be undone. When I finally named that option to myself, there was no relief, just acceptance. The reveal hadn't empowered me. It had clarified my responsibility. And clarity, when it arrives this cleanly, doesn't ask whether you're ready. It simply waits for you to act or step aside. Knowing where leverage sits is one thing. Deciding what to do with it is another matter entirely. For a while, I did nothing. Not out of fear, out of respect for the weight of the choice. Once you act from clarity, you can't retreat into ambiguity. And I wanted to be certain that whatever I chose wouldn't turn me into the very thing I'd spent years quietly resisting. I mapped out the options carefully. The first was confrontation. Direct, clean, honest. I could request a meeting, lay out what I'd seen, explain how my role had expanded without acknowledgement, and ask for recalibration. On paper, it was reasonable. In reality, it relied on something I no longer trusted: the willingness to hear truth without defensiveness. It also required me to expose leverage before securing boundaries around it. That kind of transparency in an imbalanced system often results in reassignment rather than reform. The second option was disengagement. I could reduce my scope quietly, stop absorbing extra responsibility, let gaps appear, allow the system to feel the absence of what I'd been providing for free. That approach appealed to me briefly. It was clean, it required no explanation, but it was also passive. And it placed risk on others, people downstream who had nothing to do with the imbalance. I wasn't willing to let failure become my message. The third option was departure, clean exit, new environment, fresh narrative. No need to untangle what had already been normalized. I considered it seriously. There is relief in leaving a system you've outgrown, but leaving without truth felt like abandonment, not of them, but of myself. It would preserve the illusion that nothing had been wrong, that my silence had been contentment rather than restraint. And then there was the fourth option, the one that didn't announce itself immediately because it wasn't dramatic. Formalization. I could bring my actual scope into alignment with my official role through process, documentation, and structure. Not by accusing anyone, but by removing ambiguity, by insisting quietly and procedurally that responsibility be matched with authority. This option didn't require permission. It required precision. It also couldn't be undone once set in motion. Formalization changes how systems behave. It introduces accountability where there was an assumption. It slows things down, not by obstruction but by accuracy. And it exposes dependencies without calling them out. It was the least emotional choice, which is why I trusted it. I spent weeks preparing, not in secret, but discreetly. I reviewed job descriptions. I aligned my responsibilities with compliance frameworks already in place. I identified where decisions required documented ownership and where they currently floated. I didn't create new rules. I activated existing ones. This wasn't a threat. It was a mirror. The moment I realized this was the path was surprisingly quiet. I was updating a workflow document and noticed how many steps defaulted to me without naming me. That anonymity had once protected me. Now it diluted responsibility. I closed the document and knew, if I continued to carry this without structure, I was complicit in my own erasure. So I chose the irreversible option, not because it was bold, but because it was honest. Once responsibilities are formalized, they can't be quietly reassigned. Once decision paths are documented, they can't be casually rewritten. Once authority is clarified, silence stops being convenient. This choice wouldn't create enemies. It would create friction. And friction, unlike confrontation, reveals truth slowly, without spectacle. I didn't tell anyone I decided. There was no announcement, no signal, no shift in tone. I simply began aligning my work with reality instead of expectation. The system would feel it soon enough, not as punishment, as a consequence. When people imagine decisive action, they picture motion. What I did looked like administration. I began by reviewing policies no one read unless something had already gone wrong. Governance frameworks, approval matrices, escalation thresholds. These weren't weapons, they were infrastructure. And like most infrastructure, they only mattered when weight was applied. I didn't invent requirements, I complied with them. That distinction mattered. I updated the documentation so that ownership was explicit rather than assumed. Where a decision had once been collective, it now had a named sponsor. Where responsibility had floated, it was anchored, not aggressively, accurately. I adjusted workflows to reflect reality. Tasks that had defaulted to me without acknowledgement were reassigned formally, with visibility. Not dumped, routed, sigged. Each change was small, justified, hard to argue with individually. Together, they began to slow things down. Not dramatically, just enough. I also stopped absorbing risk without authority. When asked to proceed on ambiguous direction, I requested clarification in writing, not defensively, just procedurally. For alignment, I'd say, or to ensure compliance. People complied without resistance. Why wouldn't they? It sounded responsible, sensible. They didn't notice that the buffer they relied on was thinning. Financial approvals took longer, not because I delayed them, but because I no longer bypassed review. Legal sign-offs appeared where they hadn't before. Dependencies that had once been smoothed over now required conversation. Still, no one connected this to me. They attributed it to growth, to complexity, to bureaucracy. I remained helpful, calm, available. I explained the changes clearly and framed them as best practice. I never once referenced fairness or recognition. I let the system speak for itself. What changed most noticeably was the tone of meetings. Questions that used to be answered casually now require follow-up. Decisions that once felt quick now needed alignment across functions. People began to realize how much had previously been handled off-book. And still no one panicked, because consequences hadn't arrived yet. This phase required patience. Moving in silence means resisting the urge to explain yourself prematurely. It means trusting that structure will do what emotion cannot. I kept my demeanor neutral. My calendar is full. My responses are timely. There was no visible withdrawal, only a quiet shift from compensation to accuracy. A few people noticed the friction but misread its source. They spoke about process fatigue, about how things felt heavier lately. Someone joked that we were becoming too careful. I see. I smiles. Care is not a flaw when risk is real. Behind the scenes, dependencies were becoming visible. Gaps were no longer bridged invisibly. And because nothing had broken yet, the system kept moving, just not as smoothly. The system kept... That was the point. This wasn't about forcing recognition. It was about restoring proportion. I wasn't removing value, I was making it legible. Still, I said nothing. The moment you explain structural change as personal motivation, it becomes negotiable. I had no interest in negotiation, only alignment. Eventually, others would feel the shift. Not as accusation, but as absence. The absence of ease, of quiet rescue, of someone making complexity disappear. But for now, everything looked normal. Too normal to raise alarms. And that's how you know you're doing it right. The consequences didn't arrive as a single event. They surfaced in confusion. Small delays began to stack. Not failures, just pauses. Questions that used to be resolved quickly now bounce between departments. Decisions stalled, not because anyone refused to act, but because no one was quite sure who owned them anymore. And for the first time, people noticed the absence of something they'd never named. Meetings grew longer. Agendas expanded. What used to be resolved in passing now requires follow-up. Someone would say this used to be easier without realizing what or who had made it so. I listened. I answered questions when asked, always factually, always calmly. I pointed to the documentation, to process, to approvals that had always technically been required. There was no defensiveness in my tone because there was nothing to defend. This was how things were supposed to work. A few people grew subtly frustrated, not at me, but at the system. They talked about drag, about inefficiency, about how momentum felt harder to maintain lately. No one connected that momentum had once been subsidized. I remember one meeting, in particular, a decision that normally would have been finalized in 30 minutes stretched to 90. Clarifying questions circled. Ownership was unclear. At one point, someone turned to me and asked, "What do you think we should do?" The room went quiet. That question used to be rhetorical, a way to confirm what had already been decided. This time, it wasn't. I paused, not theatrically, just long enough to be honest. "I don't have enough information to recommend a direction," I said. "And I'm not the decision owner here. No edge, no emphasis. Just truth." The silence that followed was different from before. Not dismissive, unsettled. They moved on without resolving it. Afterwards, someone messaged me privately. "Everything okay? You seem distant in there." I replied, "I'm aligned, just making sure decisions are landing where they should." That was the moment I realized the shift had become perceptible. Not to everyone, but to those who relied on me most. Projects that used to glide began to feel heavier. Not because I was withholding effort, but because I was no longer absorbing ambiguity. When something was unclear, it stayed unclear until someone with authority clarified it. And that was uncomfortable. People began to feel the weight of decisions they had once skimmed over. Risks they had once assumed were handled now required attention. Follow-through became visible. Still, no one blamed me. They couldn't. I was still doing my job, still responsive, still professional. The discomfort had no villain. That's when unease set in. You could feel it in the way conversations tightened. How often have people asked, "Can we just move forward?" In the subtle impatience when the process slowed, instinct. I watched carefully, not with satisfaction but with confirmation. The system was recalibrating itself around reality, and reality is rarely convenient. There was a moment, brief, telling, when someone tried to revert things, to bypass a step, to just handle it as we used to. They looked at me when they said it. I met their gaze and replied evenly, "We can, if we document the risk and confirm ownership." They hesitated, and then they didn't. Because once something is named, it can't be unseen. That's when I understood the consequences weren't punitive, they were corrective. People weren't losing because of me. They were losing the illusion that ease was free. And slowly, quietly, the room began to adjust. Not toward me, but toward accountability. They just didn't know yet that the hardest part was still ahead. Panic doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like urgency wrapped in politeness. It began with meetings labeled quick sync that weren't quick at all. Calendars filled with last-minute check-ins. People who had once spoken decisively now hedged their language, searching for certainty that no longer arrived automatically. The system was feeling exposed. Not broken, exposed. Decisions that had been made lightly now carried visible weight. Follow-through revealed gaps. Dependencies surfaced in places no one wanted to examine closely. And because these things had been normalized for so long, there was no clean way to fix them without acknowledging how they'd been handled before. That's when regret entered the room. Not spoken aloud, just sensed. I could hear it in the questions. How did we not catch this earlier? Why wasn't this flagged? Has it always been this way? The answer to all of them was yes. It had always been this way. It just hadn't been felt. People began retracing steps, trying to identify when the shift had occurred. They scanned timelines, reviewed documents, and compared versions. Some suspected a process change. Others blamed growth. A few wondered aloud whether we'd become overly cautious. No one asked me Yarkai. Im asked me directly, and that was telling, because asking me would have required acknowledging that something fundamental had rested on my discretion, on my quiet willingness to compensate. Instead, they tried to restore ease through acceleration. More meetings, faster decisions, shortcuts disguised as pragmatism. But once structure is visible, shortcuts leave footprints. Every attempt to bypass created more documentation, more exposure, more friction. The system resisted being smoothed back into ambiguity. There was a moment, brief but revealing, when someone suggested going back to how we used to do things. The phrase hung in the air, vague and hopeful. No one could define what that meant without admitting what it relied on, and so nothing changed. That's when confusion set in. Not about process, but about me. I noticed the glances, the recalibration. People were trying to understand whether I had changed, or whether they'd misread me all along. Some grew cautious, others grew distant. A few became uncharacteristically attentive. None of them asked the right question. Because the right question wasn't what happened. It was, why did this work before? By the time they started asking that internally, it was already too late to reverse anything. Not because I refused, but because the system had adapted. Roles had been clarified, dependencies named, accountability redistributed. You can't unsee that once it's been lived. And here's the quiet truth. Even if I had wanted to return to how things were, I couldn't. The work had changed me. Once you stop absorbing imbalance, resuming that posture feels like a betrayal of self. Once you align your actions with reality, returning to performance feels dishonest. I watched as people tried to repair discomfort without addressing the cause. They softened the language, offered appreciation, spoke about teamwork and alignment. Those things matter, but they don't undo structure. Eventually, someone did approach me, tentatively, not with accusation, but with confusion. "It feels like things are different," they said. "Is there something we should be aware of?" I answered honestly. "Things are clearer," I said. "That can feel uncomfortable at first." They nodded, didn't press. Because clarity doesn't invite debate, it ends it. By then, the panic had shifted into resignation. Not defeat, acceptance. The realization that ease had been subsidized by someone's unacknowledged labor, and that labor was no longer free. Nothing had exploded. No bridges burned, no reputations destroyed. Just a system forced to operate without illusion. And that's the hardest kind of reckoning, because there's no one to blame, and no way back to not knowing. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like one. There was no tension in the invitation, no heavy subject line, just a request for time, polite, almost cautious. I accepted without hesitation. There was nothing left to prepare. We sat across from each other in a small room with glass walls. Neutral space. No hierarchy implied. I noticed how carefully they chose their words, how measured their tone was. This wasn't an interrogation. It was an attempt to understand something that had already changed. They began by acknowledging the strain, the recent challenges, the sense that things had become more complicated than expected. They spoke in generalities, as if circling the truth might make it easier to approach. I listened. Then they asked gently, "Have you noticed this too?" I nodded. "Yes." That was it. No elaboration, no defense. The pause that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was contemplative. They asked if I felt overwhelmed, if my workload had shifted, if there was anything I needed. I answered each question plainly. My workload reflects my role. I'm not overwhelmed. I'm aligned with the current structure. Those statements weren't evasive. They were precise. Finally, they asked the question they'd been avoiding. "It feels like you're less available than before." I considered that. Not theatrically, honestly. "I'm as available as my role requires," I said. "What's changed is that I'm no longer operating outside it." Silence. Not resistance, recognition. They didn't argue. They didn't challenge my framing. Because there was nothing to contest. I wasn't accusing anyone of wrongdoing. I was describing alignment. They asked if something had prompted the shift. I shook my head. "Nothing new," I said, "just clarity." That word landed. Clarity doesn't invite rebuttal. It asks for an adjustment. The conversation didn't escalate. It narrowed. We talked about responsibilities, about ownership, about how things had evolved organically, and how that evolution had never been formalized. They acknowledged that, quietly. There were no apologies. None were needed. This wasn't about fault. It was about recognition. At one point they said, "I think we may have relied on you more than we realized." I met their eyes. I think so too. No heat, no satisfaction. Just mutual understanding. We discussed next steps, not as remediation, but as calibration. How to ensure continuity without over-reliance. How to distribute responsibility more explicitly. How to prevent the system from slipping back into assumption. It was practical, grounded. When the meeting ended, nothing felt resolved in a dramatic sense, but something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't asking to be seen anymore. I was being accounted for. As I walked back to my desk, I felt lighter. Not because I'd won, but because I hadn't compromised myself to be understood. I hadn't softened truth to preserve comfort. I had let reality speak in its own voice. That kind of confrontation doesn't leave scars. It leaves alignment. And alignment, once achieved, doesn't need enforcement. It sustains itself, quietly, reliably, without spectacle. What changed most wasn't how others treated me. It was how I located myself within the system. Before, my sense of worth had been quietly entangled with usefulness. Being the person who made things easier, smoother, and less risky for everyone else. I told myself that was professionalism. That was maturity. Now I understand it was misalignment. I didn't stop being reliable. I stopped being invisible. My work became clearer, not louder. My boundaries became legible, not rigid, just defined. I no longer needed to anticipate needs that hadn't been named. I waited for ownership to be explicit before offering support, and something unexpected happened. People adjusted, not all at once, not perfectly. But gradually, responsibility redistributed itself. Decisions became more deliberate. Conversations slowed just enough to include perspectives that had once been bypassed. I wasn't suddenly centered. I didn't need to be. What mattered was that I was no longer peripheral by default. I also became more discerning about silence. I still used it, but now as a tool, not a reflex. When I spoke, it was because it mattered. When I stayed quiet, it was because observation served better. There was no need to prove anything. The room no longer assumed my agreement. And that changed everything. I found that I no longer carried resentment because I hadn't let it take root. By choosing alignment over exposure, I avoided the corrosive aftermath of being right. There was no victory to defend, no humiliation to justify, just a quieter, sturdier sense of self. Outside of work, this clarity followed me. I noticed how often I'd overextended in other areas too. Friendships, commitments, expectations I'd never explicitly accepted. I began naming limits earlier, not defensively, just honestly. People respected that more than I expected. Some drifted. That was information, not loss. What remained felt mutual. I also became less interested in being underestimated, not because it was insulting, but because it was no longer useful. I didn't need the cover of invisibility to move carefully. I had learned how to hold my ground without noise. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about coherence. My actions matched my values. My responsibilities matched my authority. My silence matched my intention. And because of that, I felt settled in a way I hadn't before. Not triumphant, not vindicated, grounded. I no longer measure my impact by how indispensable I am. I measure it by how clearly I can step away without things collapsing, or how clearly I can step in without absorbing what isn't mine. That's freedom. If I had confronted earlier, I might have forced recognition. But it would have come at the cost of integrity. This way, the change endured because it wasn't reactive. It was structural. And so who I am now isn't louder or harder or sharper. I'm clearer. Clear about what I carry. Clear about what I don't. Clear about when to speak and when to let systems reveal themselves. That clarity doesn't need affirmation. It holds. There's a temptation, when telling a story like this, to frame it as a lesson learned too late, as if the only wisdom comes from regret. I don't see it that way anymore. What I learned didn't arrive late. It arrived precisely when I was ready to act on it without needing anyone else to change first. For a long time, I believed that being reasonable would protect me, that patience would eventually be rewarded, that if I stayed calm, steady, and generous with my effort, the system would notice and correct itself. But systems don't correct themselves out of gratitude. They correct themselves when reality becomes unavoidable. The truth is, no one set out to diminish me. No one decided consciously to make me invisible. What happened was more ordinary and more instructive than that. I made myself easy to lean on. And when people lean on something long enough without resistance, they stop checking whether it's bearing too much weight. That's not cruelty. That's human nature. Quiet dominance isn't about outmaneuvering others or withholding help until someone begs for it. It's about knowing when your silence is protecting peace and when it's protecting imbalance. It's about understanding that clarity is kinder than endurance, and that alignment is more sustainable than loyalty to a role you never consented to play. What changed my life wasn't confrontation. It was choosing not to subsidize dysfunction with my own quiet labor. I didn't demand acknowledgement. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't expose anyone. I simply stopped absorbing what wasn't mine. And when I did that, the system had no choice but to adjust. That's the part I want to leave you with. If you feel overlooked, ask yourself this. Not with judgment, but with curiosity. Are you being ignored? Or are you being relied on without recognition? Those two look very similar from the inside, but they require very different responses. One asks you to speak louder, the other asks you to step back, just enough for the truth to surface. You don't need to burn bridges to reclaim yourself. You don't need to announce your worth to people who've grown comfortable benefiting from it. Sometimes the most powerful move is alignment, quiet, procedural, irreversible. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever walked into a room and realized the outcome was already decided, or recognized yourself as the one holding everything together without being seen, I'd love to hear from you. So I'll leave you with one question, and I hope you answer it honestly, even if only to yourself. Where in your life are you still being valued for what you absorb, rather than for what you decide? And what might change if you stopped absorbing it?